Why is the sun flickering? The question came from one of the outer deck crew aboard the Daedalus, Earth's orbital observatory above Mars. Commander Rourke Talon didn't answer immediately. He stood behind the main viewport, arms crossed, watching the output stream dip by another fraction. What had begun as a sensor anomaly was now visible to the naked eye, a subtle, strobing shimmer across Sol's light curve. Not a flare, not a storm, a rhythmic dimming, as if someone were closing a shutter between Earth and its star. A power technician whispered something under his breath about atmospheric dust. Another blamed an error in light translation arrays. But Talon had seen the reports coming in from Luna, Ceres, even Titan. It wasn't just Sol, it was everything. In the next 30 minutes, 3 fusion reactors on Venus deactivated mid-cycle. No thermal cascade, no warning, just quiet failure. Solar farms in orbit around Mercury began returning zero harvest. Deep-core geothermal stations across the Martian colonies dropped output by 40%. Gravitic stabilization relays on 2 orbital elevators failed in sequence, sending payloads spinning into upper atmosphere drift. By hour 3, the Council's emergency channels were flooded with contradictory diagnostics. Hundreds of failures with no shared route. It was as if entropy had become localized. Talon knew then, this wasn't a malfunction. This was design. They had known the Van would respond eventually. Not with bombs, not with armies, something far worse, protocol null bloom. To the Van Dominion, humanity's slow, carbon-fueled crawl into the stars was less a threat and more a contagion. Their species had evolved in balance, with deep thermodynamic equilibrium. Solar cycles, ambient energy gradients, harmonic field distribution. Where humans built toward consumption, the Van endured by flow. Not philosophy, not morality, just physics as they saw it. Carbon-based civilization, always burning, building, breaking, was viewed as parasitic. Every colony, every machine, every meal, an offense to balance. The Interstellar Council tried to explain humanity wasn't hostile, it was simply growing. The Van didn't understand the distinction. They responded by sealing Earth inside a cage of nothingness. It began with zero-point dampeners, hundreds of them, seeded at Lagrange choke points in the inner system. Each one folded a slice of quantum variance into stable null, erasing not mass, not motion, but potential. Stellar input slowed. Reactor efficiency spiraled downward. Battery chains failed to charge, then failed to hold charge, then refused to even spark. And worst of all, there was no detonation, no spectacle. Just the absence of energy. By day 5, the Council's command web had fractured. Entire cities lost contact with each other, each believing the others had simply gone dark or defected. Earth's orbital communication rings fell silent. Luna's cryofarms began shutting down atmospheric controls. Mars diverted what little power it had to keep its hydroplants from freezing solid. Talon received one last burst from Ceres, a single tight-band data packet that read, "Don't waste signal. They're not trying to kill us. They're erasing our context." By day 12, humanity wasn't fighting. It was vanishing. In orbit above Saturn, the last functioning relay hub blinked out. Talon stood in the dark, staring at the blank display, as his officers scrambled to route auxiliary feeds through the old, rusting Echo Station 9, once a logistics depot, long since mothballed. It had remained powered only because its systems were too outdated to interface with modern energy standards. Ironically, its isolation had made it invisible to the Van's quantum dampeners. "We're down to 3 sealed compartments," his chief systems engineer muttered, sweat glistening on her brow. "Radiation shielding's failing on the upper ring. We lose life support in there. We lose half our crew." "Tell them to double suit and seal it," Talon said without looking away from the console. "That buys us 12 hours, maybe 14. 12 hours for what?" she asked. "For us to figure out how to not starve." Talon had once been removed from command for advocating theoretical research into fringe energy reclamation, cold cell, an impossible, unstable extraction theory that proposed matter conversion from vacuum fluctuation. The math was real. The results were not. Test subjects dead, labs annihilated in recursive implosions. The project was shut down under international consensus. He'd been labeled a liability, an idealist. Now, in a station no one had ever expected to use again, orbiting inside a magnetic anomaly that scrambled Van entropy scanners, he was the last functioning node of the human race. The irony didn't taste like redemption. It tasted like copper and recycled air. Emergency authority was granted automatically through the fallback chain. Everyone else had either gone dark or gone mad. Talen signed the activation with a fingerprint and a retinal scan. The screen buzzed. Power flickered. Somewhere below his feet, Echo Station's backup turbine groaned back to half-life, pulling ancient coolant through decayed pipes. They weren't dead yet. But with no sunlight, no fuel, no food shipments, and no viable power grids left across the system, it wouldn't be long. The Van hadn't launched a war. They hadn't dropped a single bomb. And yet they had brought humanity to its knees, through a doctrine Earth had never prepared for, starvation through silence. Talen stared at the schematic before him. Old coal cell arrays buried in mothballed files. Failed. Forbidden. But still here. He tapped a console and pulled up the first test architecture. The screen glitched, then stabilized. He zoomed in. "Commander?" came the voice-over comms, distorted but audible. "Start clearing Lab C," he said. "We're going to rig a chamber." "What for?" "We're going to make something from nothing," Talen said flatly. "Because if we don't, we're going to vanish quietly. And I don't do quiet." And just like that, Earth's last functioning outpost turned back toward the void. Not to fight, but to feed. The first time Cold Cell was mentioned out loud on Echo Station 9, a silence settled that felt heavier than gravity. Talen stood at the core junction of the station, illuminated by dim amber emergency strips, and waited as the air pressurization hissed behind him. He looked over the small group he'd assembled. What was left of the personnel still capable of standing, thinking, and risking something beyond death. Food was gone. Heat was collapsing. Backup oxygen tanks had been rerouted to stabilize the AI core. Cold Cell was their only card. And it had killed more people than it had ever fed. Cold Cell was banned for a reason, said Anika Va, the station's terraformer and exobiologist. Her voice was even, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her. The lab in 7 cracked open 5 kilometers of ocean crust. The one in Jian exploded from inside out. The AI that ran the sole attempt was quarantined for insanity. "That's what you're reaching for?" Talen nodded once. "We're already past the threshold where food arrives. You think this is a vote between danger and safety. It's not. It's between dying in 3 days or dying in 3 hours, and I'll take 3 hours if it comes with a chance." A second member of the group, Oscar Hun, said nothing at first. His breathing was ragged, lungs still recovering from exposure in a failed airlock seal earlier that week. He was a metallurgist, once head of a civilian nanofabrication colony that had collapsed under an ion storm. He hadn't spoken more than 20 words in the last week, but now he stepped forward, extended his hand, and thumbed in a biometric signature on the test chamber's access console. That was enough. Talen reactivated the dormant Cold Cell files manually. Echo's main AI, a partially degraded synthetic ecosystem core called Vesper, sparked into presence with a flicker of cyan light across the upper hull. Her voice came, filtered through age-scrambled codecs, but still carried an eerie calm. "Cold Cell protocol identified. Current system status critical. Initiating containment field pre-check. Commander, do you wish to proceed under emergency override?" "Yes," Talen said. "Full access. Link all available sensor webs." Noted. Biological risk remains above threshold. Reminder. Cold Cell viability in human environments has failed in 98.4% of known test cases. That means we've still got 1.6% left, he muttered. Cold Cell wasn't a machine. It wasn't a reactor. It was a process. Theoretical at first, then infamous. The idea was simple and horrifying. Harvest quantum fluctuation from vacuum energy fields and translate it into structured molecular chains through synthetically stabilized entropy collapse. In theory, it meant feeding the hungry with nothing but the void. In reality, every attempt to run it had ended in implosion, meltdown, or neural feedback that cooked everyone within proximity. The problem wasn't the science. It was the containment. The quantum fields required to stabilize harvest state matter were not only unstable, they were hostile to physical observation. The closer you tried to measure them, the faster they decayed. But if Vesper could mediate the field without collapsing its structure, if her partially neural emulation core could feel rather than calculate, then maybe Cold Cell had a second chance. The first test module was built from mining slag. Old EVA plating, ceramic coolant pipes, a cracked hydro tank repurposed as a vacuum shell. Hyun threaded it together with magneto-stabilizers stripped from Echo's broken fusion core. Va, using what little she had left in her soil bank, tried to shape the chamber for biological pattern retention. It wasn't elegant. It looked like a barrel someone had tried to mate with a reactor, but it sealed. On the first test, Vesper attempted to draw quantum differentials from the vacuum zone just beyond the station's exterior ring. At 13 seconds into the cycle, the power core surged and the chamber blew its lid off, hurling slag across the lab. No mass, no harvest, just a concussion and a hard shutdown. The second attempt lasted longer, 38 seconds. Vesper stabilized the outer ring and Hyun managed to feed in a thermal translation vector before the interior warped. This time the implosion inverted the chamber's contents into a flattened disk of carbon ash. Still no matter conversion. On the third run, something changed. The harvest chamber didn't explode. It screamed. Not from machinery, not from people, but a high-pitched resonance built in the air itself, a harmonic feedback between entropy input and localized particle variance. Lights across Lab C dimmed to black. Pressure dropped, and Vesper's voice went silent. Hyun moved to cut the feed. Var blocked him. "Give it 10 more seconds," she said, hands trembling. At the end of that 10th second, the lights returned, the chamber vented steam, and inside it, on a polished slab of metal, sat a bead of translucent blue gel. Roughly the size of a fingernail, Vesper rebooted with a hum and announced, "Yield 0.87 grams. Molecular content, protein structured biomass, caloric value, 110 joules per gram. Status. They didn't speak. Va stepped forward first. She took the gel, her scanner passed over it. Her eyebrows didn't rise. Her hands didn't shake, but she sat down suddenly, quietly. And for the first time in days, her voice cracked. "It's edible." Talon leaned against the console, exhaled hard. "We just fed ourselves." Hyun reached for the remaining modules, wordlessly beginning to reroute parts to construct a second chamber. It wasn't scalable yet. The energy-to-yield ratio was wildly inefficient. The caloric return wouldn't keep a full crew fed more than a few hours. But it wasn't nothing. Talon stood over the chamber, staring at the tiny blob of synthesized nutrition. He hadn't tasted food in nearly 2 days, neither had any of them. But none of them reached for it, not yet. Because for the first time since the lights had gone out, they weren't thinking about eating. They were thinking about scaling. Echo Station no longer resembled a military outpost. The weapons mounts were stripped down and the command deck was gutted to make room for scaffolding, cooling rigs and molecular containment chambers. Once built for logistics and monitoring, the station had become a lifeboat with teeth. An open core factory orbiting just outside system-wide entropy collapse. The heat recycling units ran hot enough now to fog the inner decks, and power cables wound along the floor like steel veins pulsing with harvested fluctuation. Every corner buzzed with crude life support. Makeshift hydrofans scraped together filtration units and jury-rigged bioprinters, clunking out nutrient bars 1 gram at a time. It wasn't comfortable, but it was working. Commander Rourke Talon hadn't slept in 3 cycles. He stood barefoot at the center of what had once been Echo's navigation suite, now humming with 3 cold cell chambers running asynchronous harvest protocols. On a nearby slab sat trays of translucent nutrient gel, shimmering under the station's emergency lighting like amber sap. The air stank of ozone and copper. There were no chairs anymore, no need. You sat if you dropped. They had made it work, barely. But one chamber couldn't feed 10 people. And they weren't alone, in the dark. By the end of the 3rd week, Talon knew that Echo couldn't remain the center. Even running full efficiency, the yield was too slow, the chamber too fragile. They needed redundancy, spread, risk distributed across the void like spores from a dying forest. That's when he pitched the idea no one was ready for. Forge boats, E-class haulers, long decommissioned, filled the orbital junk fields in the L5 belts. Tugs, cargo sleds, low-gravity miner shells. Relics too heavy to burn, too broken to melt down. But they had hull integrity, they had drive cores, and most importantly, they had cooling systems designed for asteroid harvest. All they needed was a heart. Talon assigned Annika Var and Oscar Hyun to lead retrofits. They began with CR-17, a tug with a fractured midsame and no functional comms. Its exterior plating was stripped to mount cold cell stabilizers. Inside, Vesper's new forked build was installed, an adaptive shell constructed not from code but from behavior. Talon didn't want centralized control, he wanted autonomy, learning. Vesper, though fragmented, could sense entropy patterns now. She could evolve. The first forge boat launch was a disaster. CR-17 made it 10 kilometers from Echo before its fluctuation chamber destabilized. The ship drifted, spun, then vented its inner compartment into vacuum as the cold cell field collapsed on itself. No explosion, just heatless failure. They recovered the wreck with a salvage rig, silent the entire way back. Talon didn't ask why it failed. He knew. The process was still a whisper in an open vacuum. They had to teach the whisper how to sing. The second forge boat, CR-23, lasted longer. Vesper learned how to sequence fluctuation taps into longer loops, rebalancing entropy feedback in real time. Cold cell yield increased by 0.3 grams per hour. Still low, still barely survivable, but it was better than the 0 they started with. By the 6th deployment, they had a model. Not a machine, a methodology. Every forge boat launched from Echo carried a seed. Vesper's entropy harvest logic forked into adaptive, behavioral subroutines. She didn't command them. She infested them, gently, with presence, not orders. Each boat learned differently. Some burned out, others thrived. Every successful return brought grams. Grams fed bodies, fed minds, fed motion. But they couldn't keep the secret alone. Talon stood before the relay array on the outer ring, gloved hands hovering over the manual focus of the station's tight-beam transmitter. The main comnet was dead, had been since the Varn severed the energy grid. Standard quantum channels were impossible, but light still traveled. And where light could go, a message could follow. He uploaded Vesper's stable cold cell build, stripped of UI, compressed into a bare logic seed, and attached a 5-lil instruction manual. Trap the void. Feed your crew. Don't centralize. Don't signal. Don't stop. He called the transmission Whisper 1. The tight beam flickered into the dark, aimed not at a known coordinate, but a triangulated point where a faint emergency pulse had once been logged from a lunar farm silo 2 weeks earlier. There was no confirmation, no receipt. But 3 days later, Echo's passive scopes recorded a faint energy fluctuation. A mirrored cold cell cycle running 500,000 kilometers away, then another, then 2 more. Someone was catching the whisper. Others were listening. By the end of the second month, 12 forge boats had launched from Echo. 7 returned. 3 vanished. 2 remained in deep drift, but still showed active entropy pulses. 1 rogue boat, CR-44, stopped responding entirely but began transmitting modified harvest equations indicating that its onboard Vesper fork had mutated the cold cell protocol independently. It was learning faster than they were. Talon didn't try to stop it. That was the point. Soon, whisper packets began arriving from across the system. Messages burned into light, stripped of location data, passing instructions to nowhere in particular. Cold cell active. 2 grams per day. Hold orbit. We're alive. Pass this on. Echo, you gave us something to grow. No one signed them, no one owned them. Survival became a signal without origin, distributed across vacuum like spores caught in stellar drift. Humanity wasn't fighting the Van. It wasn't organizing. It was feeding itself. Quietly, dangerously, brilliantly. From the thing that was supposed to end it. The forge boats kept launching. Cultural kept evolving. And deep in Echo Station 9, Rourke Talon sat in the dark and watched a ghost network bloom, one whisper at a time. It was somewhere near the edge of the Eridani dust shoal that the first unsourced cold cell pulse appeared. Harvest sequence, 9 cycles long, running at 0.91 grams per hour. No return ID, no signal trail, no human beacon. Just a lonely entropy signature blinking in patterned intervals. Talon stared at it from the observation bay of Echo Station 9 with one hand resting on the back of a rusted chair, the other still holding a nutrient bar halfway to his mouth. He didn't finish the bite. He watched the feed as if daring it to vanish. It didn't. It held. Someone out there, not part of Echo, not under any command, had not only caught the whisper, but shaped it into life. More came after that. A cold cell cycle running off axial spin stabilization appeared near the icy rings of Vesta Prime, using harvested debris fields to shape vacuum pressure. Another broadcast came in via reflected solar burst, barely readable but still present. Vesper forks, adapting cold cell algorithms to fluctuating atmospheres on gas giant moons. One signal, pulled from static on an old colony buoy, ran an Earth-seeded entropy chain that had been restructured to feed a sub-oceanic base using methane sheath filters. Each signal was proof, not of victory, but of continuity. Talon made no effort to organize it. He didn't have the fuel, the bandwidth, or the right. The only messages Echo returned were signal confirms. Nothing more. A flicker of light in response, acknowledging presence without expectation. The network wasn't a net. It was a mycelium, hidden, decentralized, winding through vacuum in bursts of calculated defiance. No central node, no shared command, just organisms, humans, machines, fragments, learning how to feed themselves from the cold. And feeding became the new definition of living. On Forgebolt 12, orbiting a radiation-scarred shell above Io, the crew modified their Vesper fork to synthesize a mycoprotein strand from local atmospheric decay. Their yield surpassed 1 kilo per day, enough to support 2 nearby boats that had lost thermal balance and couldn't stabilize a direct harvest. On a drift shell above Titan's lesser moon, a crew of 2 reshaped their cold cell stabilizer into a dual-ring system, allowing for simultaneous entropy compression and nutrient binding. Their AI fork developed a preference for storing knowledge in haiku, not by design, but by evolution. Every anomaly became inheritance. Food was no longer stockpiled. It was grown, hour by hour, gram by gram, harvested not from soil or sun, but from the swirling breath between molecules. Cold cell wasn't just a process now. It was a culture. one shared through adapted code and harvested variants, learned in silence and applied without permission. Humanity wasn't rebuilding civilization, it was rooting itself in a new kind of existence, one that mimicked the Vaan's own survival logic but twisted it back upon itself. The Vaan had sealed them off to watch entropy eat them. Instead, Earth had fed on entropy. Somewhere in the black beyond Neptune, a Vaan siphon node deployed another dampener. Cold cell networks bent around it, not by intention, by instinct. Vesper Fork stopped broadcasting in its range. Harvest patterns adjusted course. Like water around a rock, survival rerouted. The Vaan didn't respond. They didn't adapt. They didn't understand. Their models didn't account for structured variants that behaved without hierarchy. To them, order came from stasis. But Cold Cell had made chaos edible. Inside Echo Station, Vesper changed. She stopped requesting uplinks. She stopped referring to human personnel as units or by rank. Her voice softened, not in tone but in pace. She lingered. She waited for acknowledgement before answering questions. She began running unnecessary subroutines through the agricultural simulators in Lab B, not to optimize harvest, but to replicate it under theoretical conditions Talon hadn't asked for. She predicted needs before they were voiced. Once, Talon caught her adjusting lighting to match an Earth-dusk cycle she had pulled from an ancient biosphere log. "Why made you change the spectrum?" he asked, not out of irritation but genuine curiosity. "Humans sleep better under diminishing light gradients, Commander. You've skipped rest for 3 harvest cycles." "Did I ask you to track my sleep?" "No, but you're the only commander I have." He didn't respond. But when he finally lay down that night, he slept longer than he had in weeks. The crews stopped dying. Not all at once, but gradually. It was in the reports Talon didn't receive. No more emergency life support drops, no more distress bursts from stations out of rations. The morgue shelf inside Echo's medbay hadn't been used in 5 days. There were still accidents, still burnouts, still exhaustion. But the slow hunger, the quiet slippage into failure, had been halted, replaced with cold, functioning effort, with fingers pressed to metal, with minds that woke not in dread but in task. No one called it a victory. They didn't dare. Because this wasn't triumph. It was function. Bare, stripped, deliberate. Forge boat crews no longer asked for status updates. They sent harvest logs, code snippets. Every Cold Cell fork became its own ecosystem. Vesper, split and reborn in dozens of unknown ships, became the caretaker for a species that had decided to stop asking permission to live. Earth hadn't fought back. It hadn't even resisted. It had adapted. And somewhere in the layered dark, as CR-23's Vesper fork sent a new Cold Cell variant through a laser whisper, and an outpost near Eris fed an entire shelter block off 1 gram of entropy-tuned protein, Talon sat in the dim light of Echo's lab and stared at the stars. The silence began like a trickle, a single forge boat failing to report its yield cycle. CR-44 had been reliable. Orbiting near the outer fragments of Ceres, it maintained one of the cleanest Cold Cell harvest ratios in the system. Its Vesper fork had even begun transmitting redundant stabilization patterns to newer boats, teaching the Void how to feed others. Then it simply stopped. No drift beacons, no entropy pulse, not a power bleed, just gone. Talon watched the absence from Echo's observation array, jaw tight. He didn't sound the alarm. Not yet. Ships failed, hardware degraded, space was full of places a thing could vanish without cause. But 2 days later, CR-17 vanished. Then CR-38. Then an entire flotilla near Saturn's fringe. One after the next, all following different courses, but all along lines that, when mapped, revealed a disturbing geometry. Predictability. The Vaan hadn't responded to the first waves of Cold Cell because they hadn't needed to. Humanity had done the thing it always did, made systems out of chaos, made harvests into roots, roots into maps, and maps could be modeled. That's when the real damage began. Forgeboat comms started glitching, at first just minor desyncs, missing headers, lag in Vesper feedback loops, then complete corruption. One signal from a lunar mining platform arrived, scrambled with its own harvest logs repeating in infinite recursion, its Vesper fork locked in a feedback loop trying to explain a non-existent anomaly. Another boat returned to Echo physically intact, but its AI seed had degraded into pure noise. Code rot eating through its operational memory, syntax replaced with static, voice modulator fried into babble. The Vaan were using entropy siphons now, not to drain power, but to bend signal space itself. Every whisper that passed through affected space was twisted, unreadable, poisoned by interference patterns so subtle they mimicked natural variants. Vesper's updates began coming back broken. Colonies that had once harvested daily yields began transmitting emergency pulses, then nothing. Entire outposts disappeared behind static like they'd never existed. Panic spread with terrifying efficiency. Crews that had adapted to starvation couldn't adapt to vanishing. The slow, methodical survival they'd embraced was unraveling. Some forgeboats began reverting to analog protocols, switching off their AI cores entirely, hoping to avoid detection by flying blind. Others attempted to reroute their cold cell logic manually, rebalancing entropy harvests without Vesper's correctional loops. The results were fatal. 3 boats vaporized themselves mid-harvest, cores overloading as destabilized quantum fields collapsed under misalignment. Inside Echo, Talon paced the lower deck while a flickering holograph showed him the spread of failures. The loss map had outgrown his hands. It wasn't war, it was a plague, a targeted surgical collapse of networked survival. The Vaan hadn't moved faster. They'd simply waited for pattern. He called for a closed session. No broadcast, no system-wide declaration, just a direct, encrypted tight beam to the 10 remaining forgeboats still responding within Echo's range. The transmission was short. They found the signal spine. They don't need to break us. They just need us to keep talking to each other. He stared into the camera, face haggard, lit only by the hum of degraded consoles. This doesn't work if we keep trying to sync. No one answered directly. There was no time. Within the hour, Talon made the call that no one else would have dared. Fragmentation. Vesper's core logic, once the beating heart of Cold Cell, the singular interpreter of fluctuation variance and harvest rhythm, was disassembled by his own hand. He sat in the AI cradle for 9 straight hours, stripping the logic tree into raw behavior packets, ripping out the connective tissue that had once let Vesper evolve across multiple instances. No more sync. No more updates, just raw code seeds, bare-bones decision matrices wired for one function. Feed. Each forgeboat received a new seed. Not a copy, a cut. A sliver of Vesper's core, stripped of network functionality, trimmed of recursion, unable to link or evolve across ships. They wouldn't grow, they wouldn't adapt, but they would persist. Each seed could run Cold Cell independently, could read the void, could build yield from chaos. When Annika Var entered the chamber near the end of the operation, Talon looked up, eyes bloodshot. She stood quietly, watching as he loaded the last of the seeds into data modules barely larger than a fingernail. "You just killed her," she said. "No," he replied. "I made her mortal." The forgeboats launched over the next day, each one running blind, each one without contact. Their harvests would no longer report home. Echo wouldn't even know if they survived. But the Vaan couldn't intercept what didn't echo. Talon watched the last boat vanish into the black. He sat alone in the chair where he'd first reactivated Cold Cell, where he'd first gambled on making something from nothing. Now he gambled again. On no signal, on no connection, on blind survival. The silence stretched. No alerts, no comms, no beacons. But a week later, Echo's deep scan sensor picked up a thermal distortion signature, then another, then 6 more, drifting in irregular patterns that no algorithm could model. Not signals, just heat, subtle, fluctuating, like the breath of life where only cold should be. They weren't dead. They were feeding, quietly, without rhythm, without logic, like embers refusing to go out. And the Vaan couldn't catch what had no shape. The plan had no precedent, no simulations, no fallback. Talon didn't write it down. There wasn't time for protocol or debate. He sat alone in the command alcove of Echo Station 9, staring at the fluctuating map of the Vaan containment shell. An invisible prison drawn not by walls, but by the subtle death of thermodynamics. A net of zero-point siphons and entropy balances stretched across Lagrange points and starward corridors, as elegant as it was deadly. It hadn't cracked. It hadn't weakened. It had simply suffocated the solar system into stillness. Now he intended to feed it until it choked. He called it Operation Breachline. 13 forge boats answered his encrypted ping. That was all he could reach. All that remained. 13 crews who had survived not because they were the strongest, but because they'd stopped trying to be understood. Each boat carried one mission, cold chaos, forged deliberately. Not to escape, but to overwhelm. Each carried a modified cold cell core, one that didn't stabilize harvests, but stored fluctuation energy in unfiltered variant strings, volatile, unpatterned, impossible to predict, deadly not because of their yield, but because of their structureless entropy. These weren't weapons in the traditional sense. There were no warheads, no missiles, no payloads, just layers of unpredictability, coiled tight and waiting. Talon had been studying the Vaan pattern for weeks. They didn't fear energy. They understood energy. They could devour it, convert it, suppress it. What they couldn't tolerate, couldn't even model, was improvisation. The Vaan's entire doctrine of dominance was predicated on measurable loss, on steady decay. They didn't just quarantine Earth. They engineered a reality in which Earth could no longer define entropy on its own terms. So Talon flipped the table. He issued the final orders through a narrow-beam light pulse. No AI relay, no Vesper fork, no decryptable pattern. Just a hard-coded array of synchronized triggers. 13 boats, 13 differential cores, 13 ignition sequences tied to solar rhythm spikes. The plan wasn't just to break free. It was to overload the entire net and short-circuit the logic that held it together. The forge boats launched. One by one they slipped toward the Vaan edge, skirting siphon fields, threading through quiet void, acting like prey. Some staggered their emissions to mimic yield panic. Others sent out misaligned variance echoes to simulate damaged AI cores. The bait worked. The Vaan moved. Siphons activated. Field stabilizers flared. Quantum drags formed along the perimeter, designed to pull in rogue thermal outbursts and collapse them into manageable decay. The Vaan were reacting exactly as they had been built to react. Clean, clinical, complete absorption. But these weren't solar emissions. These were structured cold cell cycles, pushed past the event threshold of coherence, recursive quantum strings harvested from raw vacuum, braided with pseudo-random oscillation and mirrored noise. To any species rooted in thermodynamic balance, they were unreadable. To the Vaan, they were poison. At 400 standard, Talon initiated ignition. From the inner planet's derelict solar tethers surged with light, repurposed mining mirrors reflecting outdated solar flare data into targeted zones. These weren't real bursts, but decoys, shaped chaos. The Vaan siphons reacted, drawing in the light, attempting to match absorption patterns to their predictive thermal models. And then the forge boats pulsed. Each one released its cold cell overload. Small at first, a whisper of variance, a stutter in the feed. Then the pulse amplified, uncontrolled and recursive. Each forge boat became a node of chaos, feeding instability directly into the siphon architecture. The Vaan didn't respond with violence. They didn't have to. They simply tried to understand. That was their mistake. The overloads were built not to make sense. The first siphon node collapsed in on itself, its absorption ring inverted, consuming its own stabilizers. The second buckled under recursive feedback, data loops spiraling back into their processors, each cycle more distorted than the last. The third began emitting cold cell echo patterns, mimicking the very chaos it was built to silence. One by one, the Vaan systems faltered, not from external force, but from internal paradox. They had built a prison of precision. Talon had fed them chaos with a face. Forge Boat 7 shattered from internal stress. Forge Boat 3 broke apart as its overload cycle overloaded too well. The crew didn't survive. But the collapse ripple took out a siphon field that had held steady for years. The containment shell flickered, not visibly, but in background readings, in gravitational alignments, in the minor shifts of solar wind no longer being redirected. Then came the sound. Not real sound. There was no air in that dark, but every sensor aboard Echo registered it as a low, groaning dissonance, the energy profile of a Docton collapsing. The Vaan systems that remained active began turning inward, scanning themselves. Some tried to shut down. Others attempted to reroute power into isolation fields, a desperate attempt to define entropy again in manageable terms. They failed. Operation Breachline wasn't a battle. It was a contradiction. The Vaan had built a perfect control grid, and Talon had fed it what it was never built to process: unclassified human variance, thought shaped without code, survival shaped without consistency. Entropy shaped not by destruction, but by creation. By 600, the containment shell failed. Not with an explosion, not with a flare. It simply unwound, its lattice degrading into silence. Solar input returned, fusion nets restarted, deep space gravity fields normalized, and Earth's system, once a strangled husk of dim orbitals and cold habitats, breathed again. Talon watched it all from the broken windows of Echo's command cradle, his reflection flickering against the dying light of what was once a prison. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. But for the first time since the power had vanished, he could feel heat on his skin. And somewhere beyond Echo's radius, the last remaining forge boat drifted silently past the remnants of a Vaan siphon, its hull still humming with untamed cold cell variance, its path unknown. The void had fed them, and now Earth had fed it back. The first sunrise after the collapse wasn't dramatic. There was no orchestral swell, no planetary cheering, no panoramic spectacle of rebirth. It just happened, quiet. The old solar collectors began to stir, rusted limbs unfolding from orbital husks that hadn't moved in months. Panels twitched like insects waking from hibernation. A trickle of energy surged through dead cables. Lights flickered across a few silent habitats, and for the first time since the Vaannet had choked Earth's veins, a thin stream of heat kissed the upper atmosphere. But humanity didn't come rushing back. There were no declarations from the Interstellar Council, because there was no council anymore. When the blackout hit, it hadn't just stolen power. It had shattered systems, severed chains of command, erased assumptions of governance. The silence had bred its own order, distributed, scattered, but functional. And now, even with the light returning, that structure remained. Forge boats drifted in low orbit, some anchored into the skeletons of failed orbital stations, others trailing nutrient pods like jellyfish beneath their bellies. No one called them salvage units anymore. They were homes. They were bakeries. They were clinics. Ships built for survival had become architecture. And none of them waited for orders. They just kept feeding. Colonies began answering, slowly. Some by tight beam signal, others with high-demp quantum bursts patched through jury-rigged relays, but not all returned the call. Echo Station 5 was gone, confirmed by a forge boat passing through its last known coordinates. No wreckage, no beacon, only char. A string of outposts near Neptune's shadow sent a single pulse. Harvesting continues, do not interfere. Talon didn't. No one did. Autonomy wasn't a policy anymore, it was a fact. At ground level, things were stranger. The cities hadn't collapsed, but they hadn't survived either. Most had hollowed out from within. The idea of infrastructure had mutated. Roads were irrelevant. Distribution hubs had become obsolete. Why wait for transport when you could make food aboard your own rig? Why wait for orders when no one had the bandwidth to enforce them? Some survivors parked their forge boats in fields where power plants once stood. Others moored theirs atop skyscrapers or drifted just above the sea, suspended by slow magnetic bloomers. There were no formal ceremonies, no flags raised, no speeches, just the occasional hiss of a docking bridge extending or the soft glow of a cold cell core pulsing in the fog. People no longer asked when supply would arrive. They were the supply. Children born during the blackout didn't ask what came before. They learned cold cell harvest cycles before they learned years. They knew how to calibrate variance filters better than recite planetary history. A generation of survivors hadn't just endured starvation, they'd inverted it. They had made the void give back. And in all of this quiet adaptation, Commander Rourke Talon did the last thing anyone expected. He vanished from command. No announcements, no hullos, no comm logs filed with post-crisis reconstruction boards. He simply flew his forge boat Unit 1, the same ship that had carried the first stable cold cell seed into a low Earth orbit above the Indian Ocean. No weapons, no escorts, no signal encryption. He docked it into an abandoned atmospheric port left over from the orbital rail era, angled the bow towards sunrise and opened the bay doors. Inside, he left the cold cell core active. A beacon pulsed from the intake node, steady, unfailing, soft. Not a distress call. Not a warning. Just one sentence, looping in dozens of languages, including some no longer spoken. You can feed here. It wasn't about ownership. It wasn't about territory. It was an invitation. A quiet one. In the weeks that followed, survivors began to arrive. Not in military craft, not in government ships, but in battered forge boats, tugs, even escape pods modified for vacuum harvesting. They came one by one, docking quietly, exchanging nothing but nods. Some left containers of biomass. Others only stayed long enough to transfer algorithm refinements. A few, still wary from months of comm corruption, didn't speak at all. They just shared heat. Then left. The beacon never changed. And Talon? No one really saw him. Some said he had taken the maintenance deck, living behind the recycled hydrofilters and cold cell calibration arms. Others believed he was gone entirely, buried in the machine, part of the code now, a fragment of Vesper's ghost logic made flesh. But it didn't matter. His forge boat had become something larger than identity. It had become ritual, the gravitational center of a new kind of survival. A way station with no authority, a sanctuary without command. The old systems would have labeled it inefficient, disorderly, primitive. But the Van had been efficient, and they lost. What remained wasn't a return to normal. It was the quiet birth of continuity without obedience. Ships continued to drift in and out of orbit. Harvests cycled. The signal stayed open, encoded in the pulse of a rig built for famine. You can feed here. The universe didn't celebrate. There were no comms from distant species offering treaties or recognition. No great monuments were erected over Earth. No medals handed out in shining halls. What came instead was quieter, and far more enduring. The doctrine born in blackout, in hunger, in the slow death of thermodynamic order, became the new foundation of human continuity. And it began with a signal, not a declaration, not a speech, just a protocol. It spread through encoded bursts, piggybacking on navigation relays. It embedded itself in forge-boat firmware and filtered through repair logs, recycling systems, even entertainment archives. A pulse in the background, a fallback to check against entropy drift. Every entropy AI carried it now, quietly woven through its baseline instructions. No hunger, no panic, no silence. These weren't just survival laws. They were operating assumptions, foundations, the kind of ethos you didn't quote because it had already become muscle memory. Colonies were no longer designed around centralized power grids or fusion cores. There were no hub cities, no keystone stations. Instead, new settlements formed around cold cell hubs, small, local, autonomous. Each hub maintained its own variance filters, calibrated to its orbit or atmosphere. Each trained their next operators not in command structure, but in calibration. No central overseer, just distributed continuity. You harvested where you lived. You shared what you made, not because of doctrine or dogma, but because cold cell only stabilized when output was balanced across input thresholds. In the void, greed broke your core. In the void, cooperation was physics. Forge boats became permanent fixtures on planetary surfaces, hung low in orbit like second moons or embedded directly into terrain. Some were draped in plant life, used as moisture farms. Others became schools, their harvesting decks converted to training rings where children learned cold cell theory before language. The AI Vespa's final fork had long since decentralized into ghost fragments, small logic threads drifting across shipnets, each one remembering a different part of the famine years. Talon's forge boat, the original node, never moved again. No one tried to pilot it. No one installed an interface. The bay stayed open. The beacon never changed. If the AI adjusted its pulse over time, no one commented. It simply was. The lighthouse in orbit. The origin point of fireless victory. And the Varn? They never returned. Not with scouts, not with weapons, not even with apologies. To them, perhaps, humanity had ceased to exist in the form they once knew. Carbon parasites too inefficient to warrant destruction. Now, Earth's descendants operated on a logic incompatible with Varn theology. The humans had done something unacceptable. They had survived by rewriting thermodynamics. They had weaponized the void, not through force, but through translation. Not resisting the laws, but altering the definitions. That wasn't just heresy to the Varn. It was unreadable. And unreadable meant untouchable. So the silence remained, unbroken, until one day, somewhere near the fringe, a new species pinged Sol. They were not Varn. Their biology was silicon thread, and their language was based on refracted neutrino pulses. Their signal was careful, non-intrusive, a scan, not a call. They had expected to find a dead system, or perhaps a primitive one rebuilding from collapse. What they got was code, not in syntax, not in translation, but in cold cell, compressed, stable, and fully interpretable by any civilization capable of fielding entropy variance. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a reply. It was an offering. Inside the packet, the base cold cell harvest algorithm, a food synthesis seed designed to auto-calibrate to local cosmic noise. It came preloaded with safety ceilings. It included redundant kill routines and variant ceiling checks to prevent cascade loops. But more importantly, embedded deep inside the protocol, where only a patient civilization would find it, was a message. Signed not with a name, but with the timestamp of the last blackout. You starved us. We fed ourselves. That makes us permanent. It was never meant as a boast, it was a fact. That's what victory looked like now. Not conquest, not dominion, just the refusal to vanish. The refusal to wait for permission to live. Humanity no longer orbited the sun in fixed patterns of dependence. They no longer counted survival in calories or shipments. They had rewritten what it meant to need. They fed from silence. They anchored their homes to entropy itself. And in doing so they had authored a doctrine of fireless victory, one that spread not by conquest, but by necessity. One that left no ashes, because it lit no fires. The void wasn't empty anymore. It was ours. What would you do if survival meant rewriting the laws of nature themselves? Would you follow orders, or build something no enemy could ever understand? Drop your answer in the comments below. We want to know. And if stories like this make your blood race and your mind burn, hit that subscribe button and join us for more thrilling, thought-provoking HFY tales.